Well, a huge pleasure to welcome Mark Godsey, the author of one of the best books I have ever read on the American legal system, Blind Injustice. Mark,
Thank you,
welcome,
sir.
and thank you for taking the time out to come and join me. How are you doing?
I'm doing just fine, and thank you for the kind words. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome. I mean, obviously, the perspective, your perspective, is unique because you were, as in your own word, you were, one of these top prosecutors that, I mean, is the word ethical fair to say that some prosecutors, particularly the Ken Kratzes of this world, then they're not really ethical, are they?
Well, they don't see it that way, right?
They
They're
don't.
not ethical, but they don't see it that way. And
Hmm.
when you have unchecked power, what's the phrase? Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah.
And you're in this office of people that have a prosecutor's office that have immense power, and you're working with the culture of your work is around people that have unchecked power. An arrogance sets in, and sort of an infallibility sets in, and you're doing these things under the guise of for the public good, but it's very easy for you to start cutting corners and thinking you're sort of above the law. I don't think most of these people think of themselves as bad guys, but this is human nature, sadly.
Yes. In fact, you touched on something there. It's this sort of noble cause effect whereby that they might do something, as you say, cut corners, or maybe just a little bit of a bending of the rules here, but they see it as this noble cause. Would I be?
Yeah, I talk about that in the book. It's not a phrase I coined. It's in the
No.
psychological literature, but it's called noble cause corruption, where and this is sort of like runs rampant in police departments and homicide units, where your view is that you're doing this great good for the public, which is solving these heinous crimes, which is true.
Hmm.
And after you're in that environment long enough, you think it's okay. You start thinking it's okay to cut this corner, cut that corner. You become too sure in your beliefs, so you become positive early on that somebody you're investigating is guilty. They really do believe that, even though they might not have enough evidence. And then it becomes a matter of bending this piece of evidence, bending that piece of evidence, and they feel they're doing it for a noble cause without recognizing their own limitations, and perhaps they're not as accurate as they think they are.
Yeah, I think you talk about stuff like, your typical sort of confirmation bias, and you talk about the fact that you were bitten by a neighbor's dog when you were younger, and the story dramatically changed. Can you give us a bit of background about that one?
Well, yeah, I mean, I just, there's so many different psychological things that go into the wrongful convictions and how the system gets it wrong. And one of them is malleable memory. And it's so easy to, I mean, I did this as a prosecutor. I was trained when a witness comes in and they're giving you a story that is not true. Now you think but you weren't actually there as a prosecutor, right? So
Yeah.
what that means is it contradicts the state's theory. You're supposed to grill them and get them to quote, come to Jesus. And you would get these witnesses who would maybe start off providing an alibi for the defendant, saying, oh, he was there in the bar with me at that time.
Mhm.
And then by the time you work them over for an hour, they're saying, the more I think about it, I think you're probably right. I think he probably left before the game started. And so
Yeah.
it's important to understand how human memory is so malleable. And I talk about when I was a kid, a neighbor's dog bit me, and as time went on, the mother had convinced herself that it was completely my fault and that she had told me not to go into this particular room where the dog was, and I ignored her and I opened the door and I got bit. But none of that happened. It was
Yeah.
completely her fault. But I mean, I think if anybody thinks about their life and their family and their friends, and I do this in my class with students, anybody can come up with these examples where because we have an agenda or because we have a personal image, we sort of twist what happened to fit that personal image or how we feel about ourselves. And that's sadly human nature. But the criminal justice system needs to be better aware of that.
Sure. You also talk in your book about when you took over as the law professor at
Uh-huh.
university, and they had set up an Innocence project.
Yeah, so this is I've been a prosecutor and a hard-nosed prosecutor, and I became a law professor. And my first job as a law professor was at a law school where they had an Innocence project. The faculty member who was in charge of it was on sabbatical that first year, so the dean said, you've got this criminal investigation background, so you need to run this thing. And as a prosecutor, I was like, this is a bunch of BS. There's no innocent people in prison, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And I went to the first meeting, and these students had just gone to prison and met this inmate named Herman May. And they were all tearing up about how he was innocent and this horrible tragedy and injustice had occurred against him. And I remember sitting there thinking, this is just a bunch of BS, what a bunch of bleeding heart, stupid students. But DNA testing proved him innocent. And I talk about
Wow.
that story in my first chapter called Eye Opener, because it's not just the fact that I had been wrong and I'd been so arrogant about it, but it was after he got out of prison and I got to meet him as a person,
Mm.
and then he was humanized for me. And I thought back about how I had thought about him, and I'd not given him the benefit of any doubt, and I was ready to just let him spend the rest of his life in prison. That made me sort of ashamed of myself and really start questioning my attitudes. And so, I had this conversion that occurred that first year, but it's not by my choice, right? It was because the dean made me run this Innocence project. It probably never would have happened if not for that.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, absolutely brilliant in the book, and we've got one of your quotes. Shall we pop that one up just very quickly?
Sure.
And would you care to just read it for us?
Yep.
And I'll enlarge. Can I enlarge it a bit? I think I can enlarge it a wee bit there. Sorry,
Yep.
no, it's the one before. That's your second quote. It's the
Okay.
let's I'll tell you what it is. I need to stop that one, and I need to screen share the right actual page, which is I think that's it. Why isn't it? Because I've changed the size, I don't think it'll allow me to move. So that, yes, there's the cover of the book. There's the, and there we go. There's the one I was looking for. Sorry about that. That's a bit too big now, but anyway, yeah. If you could just read that for us, that would be
Sure.
great.
It says, so why is the criminal justice system in a silo, seemingly immune from introspection and reform? Simply put, largely because actors in the system don't have to respond to market demands. In the private sector, if an airplane crashes or a product is defective and causes injuries, or a hasty business decision costs the companies millions of dollars, market pressures require the company to take steps to ensure that such risks are minimized in the future. To do so, they institutionalize checks and balances and require that all hypotheses or business intuitions be challenged and tested to some degree before they're put into practice. That's the end of the quote. But this is why we have focus groups, and all companies will do all this due diligence before they make a decision. They don't just go off their instincts. Because millions of dollars are at stake. But the way we have it set up, particularly in the United States, with the criminal justice system, with this tough on crime hysteria, and the prosecutors just flexing their muscles for the public, there's really no checks and balances, and they can just basically do whatever they want. So if you wrongfully convict someone, it's not like that person has to buy a product off of you in the future.
Yes.
Right. So they're not responding to market demands, and it creates this stilted environment. It's dangerous.
I don't know if you can see that the next paragraph, but I think you've more or less covered that, where you say about the fact that the wrongfully convicted are not products of their consumers of their product. They don't need to fix or tweak anything to. Anyway, that's I mean, there were so many great things about the book that, as I say, I just recommended it to, for example, everybody within the Making a Murder community knows Dr. Seltman, and he got the book and thought it was absolutely fantastic, saying to everybody, you must read this. But I'm reminded, of course, that in actual fact, I actually did a series of videos about an article that you did analyzing Richard Leo's book, American in the police interrogation and the American legal system, justice system. And the absolutely brilliant bit at the end was where you gave a suggestion for a change to the Miranda warning. Could you just explain that again for us? Because it was absolutely brilliant, the idea that you would present people with a video.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure which recommendation you're talking about, but I mean, I think that when Miranda decision was decided in the 60s, what they were responding to was the fact that these interrogations happen in a hidden dark room. And I think if video technology had been what it is today, we would have had a requirement for videotaping the beginning to the end, the entire interaction, rather than Miranda. In fact, if I could pick between the two, I would pick videotaping. I think it's absolutely essential to keep a clean record of exactly what happens. It also does a better job of keeping the police in check. If they know there's if a jury is going to be able to, the public's going to be able to see what they did in that interrogation room, it's going to do a lot better than just arming somebody with their right to remain silent. So
it was like a fifth paragraph where it said that that explaining to the suspect that if you refuse to talk to us, that will not be held against you.
Yeah, well, that's part of the U.S. law, that their silence cannot be used against them.
Hmm.
Um, but that's the one piece that's missing,
Hmm.
right? The Miranda warnings are supposed to inform them of all their rights under U.S. law, but the piece, and if you decide to remain silent, we can't use it against you. They left that out of the Miranda warnings, but that's one of the biggest reasons why people decide to talk, because they think they're going to look guilty if they don't talk.
Yeah.
So Miranda, the warnings have been largely ineffective, and I think that's one of the reasons why. I don't know if that was inadvertently left out or what, but that's one of the things that if we were ever going to change it, which I don't think they will, that's what I would change.
Hmm. I mean, I actually we had the pleasure on Eric Godsey's channel last year of having a chat with Dr. Richard Leo, about his his work. And I'm trying to think. I don't think I'd actually read his book then, but then when I read the book, and then when I read your article about it, it was it was very, very interesting. And as I say, that particularly the bit about the Miranda warning and about presenting it to somebody in the form of a video, whereby you've got somebody actually talking to them, and they have to sit and watch this video, and they have to understand what this warning is. It
Right.
was
Police
it's
have learned how to just sort of say it quietly in a monotone voice, like they're just going through some formality.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hmm.
Yep. So, so you set up at this the law school that you're at. You had to sort of take over the Innocence project then there, but how did you then progress to being the director of the Ohio Innocence project?
Well, I'm from Ohio originally, Cincinnati. And
Right.
so a year or two after I got that first teaching job and become a believer in the innocence movement, a criminal law position opened up at the University of Cincinnati, which is where I wanted to end up. So I got that job and I founded the Innocence Project here, the Ohio Innocence Project, with some other people. That was back in 2003. So we've been in operation for 18 years now. We've now freed 32 people
Wow.
in Ohio who together served 640 some years in prison for crimes they didn't commit. One person served 46 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Another one served 39, including part of that time on death row.
Mm.
Ricky Jackson, he came within a couple months of his execution date back in the 70s, actually got off of death row on a lucky technicality back then. Would not have been around to see his vindication and exoneration, if not for really just pure luck.
Wow. And so is it quite a big concern, as in staff within the Innocence Project? Have you got, obviously, yourself? What have you
Well,
got,
now
like
we're
a
up to
team?
about a staff of 10. So we've
Oh,
got,
wow.
we're getting ready to hire another lawyer. We've got a policy person who does legislation and works with the senators and representatives and does public awareness education speeches at colleges and high schools with our exonerees. We've got, I think, about 6 attorneys now. When we hire the new one, it'll be up to 6. Paralegal and executive assistant, secretary, a part-time PR guy who does social media and all the writing and that sort of thing, and then a fundraising development person.
Yep. And I'm right in saying that also your wife is also a lawyer?
Yeah, my wife does a lot of these cases. In fact, she had her own exoneration around this time last year,
Wow.
where it was a case with the Ohio Innocence Project, but really she was the main person who did the case and brought it to us and fought in court for 12 years.
Yeah.
And finally, at the beginning of the pandemic, was able to get the conviction overturned. Of course, as always, the state's appealing it. They're trying to put them back into prison, and these things drag out forever. They never just go away after you win. They always appeal and try to get the victory overturned. That's what's going on in Chris's case as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I can only, I can't even begin to imagine the euphoria of actually winning somebody's freedom and actually walking out with them. I mean, that's what we're certainly looking forward to with Kathleen Zellner and Stephen Avery.
Mhm.
Now, obviously, you make quite a few references to Making a Murderer in the
Mhm.
book. What what are your sort of overall thoughts on the documentary series Making a Murderer? It seems to me like it's an epic. It's
Yeah,
20 hours long.
it was a watershed moment for our movement, because before Making a Murderer, when I do a lot of public speaking,
Mhm.
people didn't really get it, or they would almost think I sounded like a conspiracy theorist when I
Yeah.
talk about some of our cases. And then now I can say, it's like Making a Murderer. You saw that, and 3/4 of the crowd saw it, and they get what I'm talking about. And I can make references. In this case, we think it might have been police tampering or something, just like when they did, and so it really is the thing that made the people understand what's going on in our cases. So I think it's got extreme importance to, the ability of our long-term ability to reform the criminal justice system.
Yeah. There's also, like, I suppose, for want of a better word, the guilters accused making a murderer of being biased. My perspective is that compared with what the journalists were putting out before and during the trial, anything that goes against what the prosecution was saying is going to seem to them to be biased. But to me, it just seems like, no, it's just a factual account. This is what happened. They interviewed the various people. Certain members of the prosecution didn't want to talk.
Yeah.
And that's construed as biased.
Well, I mean, I think they probably had an agenda to point out the corruption and the flaws
Yes.
in the system. So that's what they were going to focus on. But those flaws and biases in the system are there.
Yeah.
And most of the time, journalists aren't focusing on it.
Yeah.
So, so in that way, it was sort of watershed. Yeah, they weren't trying to go out and show both sides of the case. They were trying to show systemic flaws in the system and how they appear in this case. And that's all true and honest.
Yeah. How do you find the majority of journalists in Ohio?
Yeah.
Are they again? Do they a little bit like in Manitowoc in Wisconsin? Do they just tend to parrot any kind of state narrative?
Often that's the case, and it's gotten worse because the newspapers have lost a lot of their funding and they've cut their staff down. When I started doing this work almost 20 years ago, you could go to a local paper and you could often find an investigative reporter who was willing to do a deep dive and really sort of cover it. And if your side deserved to be believed, which often it was, they would believe our side and they would cover it from our perspective. But now they're so short staffed, they really they don't do deep dives. Even if the truth is really one-sided, they'll report both sides because they don't have the time to get into it and figure out the truth. So it's really kind of sad what's happened to investigative journalism.
And I suppose we're fast running out of time, but I really wanted to get your opinion on, if to me it seems as though people are talking about a broken system. For me, it would seem as if when the system works, it's fine. It's just making sure that it works, But are there reforms going forward, such as other things, such as you mentioned the Miranda? But how would you like to see, now that you're an Innocence project director, how would you like to see things change? And
I mean, there's so many, and that's what the sort of the end of my book is. But there's procedural things like the way we record, recording all interrogations, changing the way we do police lineups. So procedural training things. But then there's also things from like a mile high, like in the United States, I think it's a travesty that judges and prosecutors are elected.
Yes.
There needs to be a better understanding of human nature and the psychological flaws and how power, affects judgment. So that, because when a prosecutor comes in, elected prosecutor who actually has humility and understands these issues, they can create a culture in their office that makes the office much more fair and workable. So it can be done, and it really starts from the top. The problem is that with elections and the tough on crime environment we've had for decades, it creates this sort of toxic masculinity where everybody just wants to flex and act tough on crime every single second. And that's what leads to these outrageous outcomes. So really, training and changing the culture to understand all these psychological flaws, in addition to all the sort of procedural things that I recommend.
I must admit, I had that kind of conversation with the likes of, once I asked Jerry Buting about Patrick Willis, and I said, well, why is he just acquiescing to everything that Ken Kratz says? And he said, yeah, because he's up for re-election the next year. And it was a quote by John Farrack, that these can you imagine the judge going for re-election? And in one of the advert breaks of the Packers game, he's saying, now the reason I didn't find this person guilty, the reason why I moved to have this person cleared was because I actually didn't think he was guilty, whereas the judge that goes on says, I'm hard on crime, it's tough on crime, we need to clear up. It's obvious who's going to be the winner. Nobody's going to vote for the one that says, I think some of these cases, it could be there could be changes made to improve the legal system.
Yeah, the elections result in these perverse outcomes. Yeah,
Yeah.
it creates just a totally contaminated culture.
I mean, the other big one, which certainly seems to be changing. I've never fully understand why police have qualified immunity and prosecutors and judges have absolute immunity,
Mhm.
but I think that's beginning to change now.
I think it's beginning to change in the U.S. and even conservative judges like Justice Thomas are coming around. He's made some speeches that we need to get rid of qualified immunity and absolute immunity. And I actually think that is, I think there's a couple of states that recently,
Hmm.
just in the past, just in 2021, passed laws cutting back on immunity for police officers and prosecutors. So I think that we're at the beginning of a trend, and I hope to see it continue because, again, they don't have to respond to market demands because they're untouchable,
Hmm.
right? And so it's
Yes.
just like, these companies, they started making products safer once they started getting sued.
Yes.
And so now they're responding to market demands. And when you take away all those incentives to do things the right way, then and you give people immense power, then it's not going to end up very good. You're going to end up in a bad place. And that's where we've ended up in the criminal justice system.
Sure. Um, I mean, obviously, making a murder. We're in absolute agreement that I think for me it was a game changer. I knew nothing at all about this. My daughter asked me back in 2016. She said, "Dad, have you ever heard of a place called Manitowoc?" No. Have you ever heard of a guy called Stephen Avery? No. And then she told me that, well, he was arrested and he did 18 years of a 32-year sentence for something he turned out he didn't do. And then the nephew admitted to it because she said to me, would the police frame somebody? I said, no, 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 they wouldn't do that because it's too risky if they get caught out. And she said, well, you have to watch this Making a Murder, it was mind blowing. You know what my immediate reaction was? I got in touch with Sheriff Herman and said, what the dickens is going on? The sheriff of Manitowoc County. And I had quite a few nice conversations with him, nice enough fella, as we were saying earlier, your Jim Lenks, your Andy Colbins. I'm sure that, if, when they were on patrol, if you had a flat tire, they would help change your wheel.
Exactly.
But,
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you saw a picture that you actually went over there, right?
yeah. Yeah.
My wife's running a marathon there in a couple of weeks.
Wow.
So she's gonna have to go there as well and get that picture in front of the Avery Salvage Auto Yard or whatever, if it's still there. Is it still there? Do you know?
Yes, still there. Yep, yep. And you can actually go into the salvage yard itself, and they've got like a little sort of shop thing that you can go in, and you get like some merchandise, making them.
Wow, that's
Well,
awesome.
Avery merchandise, for example, you can get like your baseball caps and your t-shirts and your hoodies.
Wow, that's
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah. So yeah, it's Chuck and Earl that mainly run the place. I mean, Alan's more or less sort of retired from it, and bless her, Dolores isn't always in the best of health.
It's sad.
Yeah, I was going to say though, as iconic as Making a Murderer is, and you know, I can list. I mean, I've did a list a while back of about 24 Netflix documentaries and other documentaries that I think can make a difference because you'll have new people coming along with new ideas, and
Mhm.
and things will change in that way. Are there any other documentaries that you've watched that you've thought, wow?
Um, so I really liked the one on Amanda Knox, and
Mhm.
I'm personal friends with her as well. I thought the staircase, I can't remember if
Yeah,
it's called the staircase, the
yeah,
stairwell. I always get that
Staircase.
mixed.
Yeah, yeah,
The staircase, it does a really good job.
yeah.
It's very worthwhile watching. Um, I know I do have a list somewhere because I give it to my students, but I'm blanking right now, being put on the
Well,
spot. But yeah,
I tell you what, I've got a question for you because
yeah.
I 2 years ago, when Dean and Jerry first came to Edinburgh, me and the wife went up to Edinburgh to watch it, but we were right at the back in the clouds. And so when Jerry and David Rudolph were coming to Edinburgh, I said to my wife, "Do you fancy going and watching this?" He said, "No, not really. I've seen them all already in Edinburgh. I said, "You fancy going to Amsterdam to see them?" And immediately, a trip to Amsterdam. So I went along, and it was weird because as I was turning up at the theatre, pulling up in a taxi was Jerry Butin. Oh, hi, Paul. And he said, "Oh, have you got any questions? Because you know how you like to sort of write down questions."
Mhm.
So Jerry took my question and actually read it out. This was the very first question that was sort of read out and answered on the day. So I'll because you mentioned the staircase. Here goes. Who's more unethical, Ken Kratz or Jim Harding?
Oh boy,
Now, I must admit,
that's hard.
David Rudolph went first, and he did a superb job of explaining why it was Jim Harding with that, that procession when they exhumed Catherine's body, and just to get the coroner to look at it and say that she died as a result of a
Yeah, that was
homicide.
unbelievable, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Unbelievable. Talk about confirmation bias and junk science, and
yeah,
oh my goodness.
yeah.
Yeah.
But then we had that Jim Harding, we had Martha Black, and sometimes when David Rudolph does presentations by himself, he does this thing about Shami Shabani.
Mm.
He was the guy. He was it during. It didn't make it into the staircase. This bit, but Shami Shabani was one of the so-called experts in the staircase, and David Rudolph is having a go at him and saying, he did a bit of research on this expert, and in one case, Doug Plude up in Wisconsin, this guy was found guilty of murdering his wife,
Hmm.
and the claim by the defense was that she'd actually drowned herself by accident in the toilet.
Hmm.
And so this Sami Shabani had carried out this experiment, this scientific experiment where he'd held people's heads underwater to see if it was, or telling them to hold their head underwater to see if you can kill yourself by holding your head underwater. Absolutely unbelievable.
That's
You know,
so idiotic.
but also, I suppose the follow-up question would be, Jim Harding, Ken Kratz. But what about the judges in these three cases? There was Orlando Hudson at the end of the staircase. He says, I would have done things differently, but at least it shows that the system works. And you're thinking, but
Yeah.
this is like 14 years later,
Yeah, I know the levels of and the layers of denial that would have to be peeled off that onion to get down to the truth is just shocking. Yeah,
Yeah,
and the same with Making a Murderer. You sit there and go, well, this is what I see every day. This is why I was glad that something like Making a Murderer came out, because I could make references to it when I'm giving a speech about one of my cases, and I say the judge wouldn't let the guy out.
mm-hmm.
The public is shocked, whatever audience I'm speaking to, and they can now start to understand. They can see the bias in the system. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
helpful in that way, even though it's sad.
It is indeed. I don't know if you've managed to follow much about the latest proceedings on the Stephen Avery Brendan Dassey case, but
I have not.
we're at the Court of Appeal stage, and they haven't to. At some point, the Court of Appeals will have to adjudicate on the fact that when Stephen Avery was in his appeal stages, he lost at the Court of Appeal stage, and it was going to go to the, he obviously appealed to the Supreme Court. We find out that surreptitiously, Wiegert, Tom Fallon, and Norm Garn got together and gathered up all of the bones, not just the ones that were in that sort of pizza box, but also the ones that were found in the quarry, that Ken Kratz said that the best we can say about them is that they're possible human. So in other words, animal bones, gathered them all up and gave them back to the holdbacks.
Wow.
Yeah, in complete contradiction of Judge Willis's, preservation of evidence, DNA evidence order.
Wow.
Yeah,
It never ends.
it is, and it. What's brilliant about it for me is the fact that it's, obviously Kathleen Zellner, very, very successful. She's got a good team behind her, but by having so many, for want of a better word, armchair investigators, computer keyboard investigators looking at this, she's getting so much more leads and so much more information.
Mm-hmm. I bet.
It's yeah. Mark, I must let you go because it's just after. Is it 2 o'clock your time?
Yes, it is. But I
Yeah.
appreciate it. Thank you very much for having me on. This was fun.
Well, yeah, and
Keep up the good work.
all I can say is, if you haven't got it already, you must get this book because it's an absolute brilliant read. I mean, in fairness, a lot of the books that are written from the point of view of looking at the system are. I always remember I once had an exchange of conversation with Ken Kratz through one of his aliases, and I said to him, I said, Ken, has anybody ever written a book to prove that false confessions don't occur? And he said, well, no, there isn't any literature like that. But maybe you'd like to start with my book.
Gosh, he's shameless.
It's incredible. No, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. Many thanks for accepting the invitation. And maybe as we get further down the road with the Making a Murderer case, maybe you'd accept an invitation to come back on
Sure
at some
would.
future date, because
Yep.
that would be absolutely brilliant. And I would like to thank you on behalf of the dude who passed away last year. I'm in his studio, Eric Godsey. So yeah, many thanks. Oh, sorry, one final question.
Yep.
That character there is Captain Crunch.
Yep.
Me and the dude used to argue cat and dog about the fact he would say that Captain Crunch is British and I would say he's American. What do you reckon?
I would assume he's American just because I grew up seeing it on commercials, but I
Thank
don't
you.
know. I actually don't know the answer.
Thank you. Is the voice actor is Dawes Butler that did Yogi Bear, Huckleberry Finn, and a few other of them, So yeah, thank you very much. I've had so many people come on and say you must be British or even some other country. It's been.
Well, the only thing I'm sure about is after I ate it, my roof of my mouth was all scraped up like I'd rubbed it with sandpaper.
I did. I have eaten it. It's very nice, I must admit. But yes, you're absolutely right. It does. You really need to soak it in the milk for quite a while, don't you?
Exactly. All right. Take care.
Okay. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Yeah. We'll see you soon. Bye for now.